I got the question today of if morality is objective. And I think this is a little bit outside of my interest, but it's relevant in some ways to what I'm interested in. And I have immediate answers to this. I think that the framing of morality is often the wrong way to think about a lot of things. And our typical thinking of morality is not good. It's not the best framing of it. So I think an alternative, and this is how I think is a good way, I think this is a viable alternative for the normal way of thinking about morality, is to just think about behaviors and look at how widely these behaviors can apply. The behaviors are used to solve problems or to do something. And there are some behaviors that only work in a very narrow range of contexts. You can only do it in a particular culture, or you can only do it at a particular time. And it wouldn't work if you did it multiple times, or it wouldn't work if a lot of people in your culture did it. There are those types of behaviors, and there are other behaviors that work in many different contexts and work if you did it repeated times. And there are some behaviors that, let's say, are not compatible with a growing culture or a sustaining culture or a culture that can persist. And then there are other behaviors that are highly compatible with a culture that persists and in fact encourage the growth of that culture, or encourages the growth of knowledge within that culture so that there can be progress. So there's behaviors that are good for the culture, for persisting, and there are behaviors that are not so good for persisting. And if we just think about that divide, the behaviors that are not really great for persisting mean that the behavior will not last for long, right? There's a narrow range of contexts which it could apply, because of course it would destroy the culture, and then you won't be able to do the behavior because there's nobody there to do the behavior. And you have other behaviors that are good for the culture, and they can continue to happen because the culture persists, right? So there's like this difference of what I'm thinking of as reach, with some behaviors that have very narrow reach and some behaviors have wider reach. And then we can think about the reach in more ways than just that. We can think about reach in terms of, does it work multiple times? Like if one person does one of the behaviors multiple times, does it apply multiple times, or does it only apply one time? Right? And this is again another measure of reach. If there's a behavior that only works one time in your life, but you can't do it multiple times, that's a narrow reaching behavior. Or if you have a behavior that only works for one person in the society at a time and not for many people in the society at a time, it's again narrow reaching because it doesn't work in a lot of contexts. I think instead of looking at normal traditional morality, we can just think about the search for behaviors that are wide-reaching behaviors. Now, you don't actually have to search for them, but by nature of them being wide-reaching, they're going to persist longer than the narrow-reaching behaviors. And they're going to fit into more context than the narrow-reaching behaviors. Even in different parts of the multiverse, you might have a behavior that works. If it works in many contexts, it's going to work across the multiverse because every part of the multiverse has slightly different contexts. But if it's a narrow-reaching behavior, then it won't work across the multiverse sometimes, because the multiverse has slightly different contexts, and it just won't work in all those contexts. We can think of an alternative to whatever traditional morality as finding the limits of our behaviors. That's just finding the context in which the behavior will solve a problem or work in whatever way, and then finding alternative behaviors that work in a wider range of contexts that solve the same problem. Perhaps you can also find behaviors that have fewer issues behind them, or if you have two alternative behaviors, one of them doesn't work in a wider range of contexts, but one of them has fewer issues. You can think about all that kind of stuff. So it's just a behavioral learning about the limits of our behaviors. And I think that this is the idea of punishing people for doing the wrong thing or having rules to do the correct thing. Both of these are crude ways of encouraging wider reaching behaviors and discouraging narrow reaching behavior. So I think the normal sense of morality is pointing to something right but I just think people just aren't aware that punishing people is itself a narrow-reaching behavior. It's not a very effective way for solving the problem. You can have more effective ways of solving that problem, and it's not very good for society. It doesn't help with knowledge creation if people feel like they're being punished, right? In the other sense, having rules is very similar. Making people follow rules without understanding why to follow those rules is not a very good way to encourage knowledge creation, and it's not very good for the society. I think this is just like a preliminary proposition here, but a better way is to have people actually understand the reach of the behaviors that they're doing and understand that an alternative would be better. It's literally just the normal critical mindset of understanding alternative options. This is a reframing of morality. And in this sense, you can find things that are, I think the measure of reach is very close to the measure of objective. Now, I don't really know what objective means. A lot of things to a lot of different people, so it's not quite clear what somebody might mean if they're asking about objective morality. But the fact is, there are going to be some behaviors that work in more contexts than other behaviors. And whether or not we want to call that objective, I don't think is necessary or relevant. There just are behaviors that work in more contexts. Sometimes you're going to have behaviors that are good for a society or a species that wants to persist or progress. Whether it wants to or not, it's good for a society that progresses, or it leads to societies that progress. And that's going to fit into all cultures that progress, including cultures that are outside of human cultures. It's not limited to humanity. In any case, that's my answer to the question of, is morality objective? I think that the framing of it is incorrect. However, there are behaviors that are wider reaching than others and fit into more contexts. And we can find the behaviors that fit into so many contexts that it go beyond any individual culture or even beyond humanity.